a little story. I don't usually tell this story, but you know, you guys might appreciate it. I got into this stuff through the experiences which are recorded in my book, Spirit Walker. And I hope that you will eventually read that book if you haven't already. Because of those experiences, I was drawn inexorably in the direction of the knowledge, the deep knowledge of the Hawaiian kahuna mystics, because I was living in Hawaii. I was living in Hawaii when all of this happened. And in my search for understanding, in my search for patterns of meaning and causality, in the experiences that I was having, my wife put a book in my hands which was focused on kahuna knowledge. And I began to read in this esoteric tradition. And so inevitably, I stumbled across something which we're going to talk about tonight, which for me gave the whole game away, and it helped me understand why it was possible not only to have the experiences that I was having, but also how it was possible for me to connect with the mind and soul of a man who lives in the future. That's not a small thing, all right? To find something, it just sort of drops into your lap through the universe that helps explain some extraordinary paranormal experiences that are going on. Well, as you know, and I've mentioned this, Spirit Walker is the autobiographical account of how I went crazy in Hawaii. All right? It's the autobiographical account of 12 extraordinary paranormal experiences that occurred over a 4-year period. And the way in which I wrote the book, I had all sorts of chapters in between, searching for those meanings of, those patterns of meaning and causality. Now, inevitably, when I wrote Spirit Walker, I wrote something about this kahuna knowledge. And I understood quite clearly that in writing about this, I was trespassing to some degree. I was trespassing into the knowledge of the indigenous people of Polynesia. And I know, and you know, I'm sure, that indigenous people don't like it when outsiders trespass into their spiritual traditions, especially anthropologists. I mean, anthropologists are considered to be vermin by many indigenous groups. So I knew when Spirit Walker came out that sooner or later the kahunas were going to send somebody in to have a look at me. Well, in 1996, the year after that book came out, my wife and I took our kids back to Hawaii for the first time since we'd left in 1989. And we visited familiar haunts. We saw old friends. My kids were climbing coconut trees like monkeys. They were boogie boarding the big ones. They were snorkeling with the sea turtles. You know, they're very Hawaiian, my children, because they were raised there. And it was during this time that I was invited to speak at an institute up in Waimea, which is in the northern part of the island, the big island of Hawaii. It's where the headquarters of the Parker Ranch is, which at one time was the largest privately owned ranch in the world, even bigger than the King Ranch in Texas. Now, on that occasion, my wife and I drove up there. And the institute at that time was housed in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, a hemicycle home. It's since been sold, but at that time it was a newly built house. And on that day, about 50 people showed up to hear what I had to say. I thought this was really cool, you know, because before I wrote a book, nobody cared what I had to say. But after I wrote a book, everybody wanted to hear what I had to say. It was like I suddenly became important, you know. Well, it rained torrentially just before I was supposed to speak. And as we all looked outside the windows at this downpour, all right, the windows looked out over these magnificent volcanoes. Mauna Kea, Mauna Loa, Hualalai, the 3 great volcanoes of the island of Hawaii. We could see them all, these sweeping views from this magnificent home. And it rained torrentially, and of course this new roof promptly sprang all sorts of leaks. And everybody's frantically dashing around doing the mop-up, you know, and then suddenly the rain stops. Well, one of the things that I was dimly aware of at that time was when the Hawaiian deities arrive, when the gods and goddesses arrive, they usually come concealed in clouds and rain or fog. This is a dead giveaway. And I was aware of this. Most of the people who were there took this as a very good omen because they knew this too. And there had also been a drought. This was the first break in the drought. So all this was very propitious. Well, I'm just about to launch into my talk. And the door opens. And in walks this big Hawaiian man. Now this man was about half a head taller than I am. He outweighed me by at least 100 pounds, maybe more. He had a great big beard down his chest, a great big white ponytail down his back. He's carrying a great big walking stick in front of him. He's got an aloha shirt on. And he's got 4 more Hawaiian men with him, all of them with beards and ponytails. And I went, gulp. The day had come. The time of reckoning was there. They had come to look me over. Well, my hosts introduced me to this Hawaiian. And I learned that his name was Hale Makua. Hale means house. Makua means parent, or father, or mother. The house of the father or mother, the house of the parent. That's what his name meant. Hale Kealohalani Makua. Now, I'd been hearing about this guy for years. I'd heard about this man for years. All right, this guy, everybody in Polynesia knew him because of his genealogy. On his mother's side, he was descended from High Chief Kamehameha Nui, who became the first king of Hawaii in the 1700s. And on his father's side, he was descended from High Chief Keoua, Kamehameha's cousin, who was defeated and killed in order for Kamehameha to become the king. So to say this guy had an exceptional genealogy was an understatement of vast proportions. There was virtually nobody else like him in Hawaii. So everybody knew who this guy was. When he got off the plane in Tahiti or Bora Bora, Huahine or Raiatea, he would be mobbed. He would be mobbed at the airport by people who wanted to talk to him, who wanted to touch him, who wanted to take him home and feed him, who wanted to, hang out with him. I mean, people knew him in Easter Island, they knew him in New Zealand, they knew him all over Hawaii. Everyone knew him. This is a man who was invited to speak at the United Nations twice. And the second time he spoke for 5 days to indigenous elders who'd come from all over the world to hear what he had to say. What this reveals is that this man who'd come to look me over wasn't just any kahuna, all right? This was the big kahuna. Well, this is a very good time to have spirit helpers. And so I breathed a short prayer. And then I launched into my talk. And my talk was, focused upon the transformational community. Hey, that's us. The transformational community. And the beliefs and values that we hold near and dear. And I suppose I gave a rather academic talk, and all these Hawaiians are sitting there like stones watching me. Now, they brought their wives with them. That was a good sign. That meant I wasn't going to be turned into a pillar of salt, at least not that day. And they all listened very politely to what I had to say. And every once in a while, I would say something great, and suddenly they'd all do this. That was it. But it happened several times. They'd all in unison go. So I guessed I was getting through. Well, toward the end of my talk, I began to get this nagging feeling that Makua had something he wanted to say. And so I looked over at him, and he's watching me, all right? I looked over at him, and I said, Makua, I'm getting this feeling that there's something that you have to say. Allow me to invite you to speak, if that's appropriate. I didn't know what the protocol was, so that's how I said it. Now this is a man who traveled with 27 generations of his ancestral spirits in constant attendance upon him. He kind of looked down, then he kind of leaned over this way as though someone was talking in that ear. Then he kind of leaned over this way as though somebody was talking in this ear. Then he smiled again, and he stood up. He looked at me across the room, and he said to me, "A friend of mine sent me your book, and I read it. Listen, the room was dead silent. This was high noon in Polynesia. You know, this was the moment of truth. He said, I read it again just to make sure I got it right. And then I took your book and I went down to the beach and I put it down on the sand. And I called in the ancestors and we had a talk about you. Standing there. He said, the ancestors asked me what your name is. And I told them, your name is Wesselman, Hank Wesselman. And he kind of smiled. And he looked at me and he said, the ancestors told me I wasn't pronouncing your name right. Now, I'm going to say something from a place of sharing, not from a place of ego. He said, the ancestors told me that your name is Wesselman, that you are a vessel like the canoe. And he's looking at me to see if I'm getting it right. You know? And I'm slowly going into shock because I'd been expecting him to condemn me. I'd been expecting him to say, look, you're not Hawaiian. Stop writing about us. And he would have been fully in his rights to do so. The Hawaiians have real mixed feelings about all these outside people who've written books on huna. I'll say something about that in just a moment. Now, I didn't know it, but Makua was clairvoyant. And he picked up what I was thinking. He was reading me like a book. He picked up what I was thinking, and he smiled, and he said, don't worry, we Hawaiians don't write, we talk. And we share what we find in our hearts with each other. But in your culture, it's the tradition to write. And so I've been instructed by the ancestors to say to you, in front of all these people here, that everything you wrote in your book is true. And we Hawaiians support you. Keep spreading the word. You're making my job easy. Whoa! You know, people were crying. People were crying. This was very rare. Something very rare had just occurred. It's very, very seldom that the indigenous elders endorse outsiders. Okay? And he laughed and he came walking over to me with his walking stick and he says, we should have a meeting before you leave the island. Well, we had our meeting right on the edge of the volcano crater of Kīlauea at 4,000 feet in Volcano National Park. And that's the day that he and I got to know each other. This was the beginning of a most extraordinary friendship. A most extraordinary friendship indeed. So I would like to, with his permission of course, draw on some of the knowledge of the kahuna mystics and share it with you tonight. And in doing so, my hope is that I will reveal something of how you are put together. We're going to talk about the nature of the self tonight, from the kahuna perspective. The nature of the self. And one of the interesting things in the kahuna tradition is that they understood that each one of us is composed of 3 distinct souls. 3 distinct souls. Do you remember where we ended up last class? I hope we ended up there last class. I was very tired last week. Talking about Pythagoras and Pythagoras' understanding that each one of us is composed of 3 principias, 3 principal aspects which come together to create the self. Well, this knowledge was generally known at one time. Pythagoras lived over 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. The knowledge that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is equally as old, if not older, and comes from Polynesia. Now, in looking at the kahuna mystics, let me make a few intro remarks. First of all, those of you who've been to Hawaii know that the Hawaiian language is composed of very long words And each syllable has a meaning. So you've got the word meaning itself, and then inside the word, there's kind of like a hidden meaning. For example, the word kahuna. The word kahuna means a master or an expert of something. That's what it means, an expert. And everybody's an expert of something. If you break the word down into 3 syllables, ka, hu, and na, ka means the, or the one. Hu is something which is in motion, something which is agitated, something which is stirred up. When you stir your coffee, that's hu. When water is boiling, that's hu. When fish are rising to the surface and it agitates the surface of the ocean, that's hu. Na is something which is very calm, very settled, very centered. All right, so this interesting word kahuna has an interesting yang-yin quality to it, with the hu being the yang and the na being the yin. Yin is something like the heart, that's na. The core of an apple, that's na, the center. Something which is settled, that's na. So there's an interesting duality in this word kahuna. I bet you didn't know you were going to get a Hawaiian lesson tonight, huh? I've thrown up a few words here because I'm going to be using them. And I'll just say something about them before we look at the slides. The Hawaiians had a state-level society, a stratified society like ours. All right? On top, they had a ruling class, which was derived entirely from a chiefly class, which was called the ali'i. The ali'i. And below the chiefly class were all of the stockmen, the weavers, the water carriers, the fishermen, the merchants, the clothing makers, the oil makers, and so forth and so on. They were called the maka'aina, the commoners. Maka means eyes and aina means land. They were the eyes of the land. In accordance with their stratified society, they had a stratified religion. We talked about that. As our perception of ourselves becomes more centralized and more stratified, our perception of the supernatural world becomes more stratified and more centralized. So on top, we had these high deities called the akua, high gods and goddesses, a polytheistic belief system. We had ordinary, everyday spirits, the spirits of nature that were called kupua, and we had ancestral spirits called Makua. And the word Makua, depending on how it is used, is also the term which is used for the higher self, or the oversoul, which we'll talk about in the second half tonight. As I mentioned, the word huna refers, maybe I didn't mention it. The word huna refers to something which is hidden or concealed. And that word was specifically chosen by one of the early investigators of kahuna thought, an individual named Max Freedom Long, who was a school teacher in Hawaii back at the beginning of the 1900s. He was one of the first outsiders to turn a sensitive eye towards the esoteric traditions of the kahunas. It was him who chose the word huna to describe the Hawaiian spiritual tradition, because as a result of Christian missionary activity, which was relentless, a lot of this knowledge had been lost, and what remained had been sort of driven underground. It was concealed. It was hidden. I used the word huna talking with a Hawaiian elder named Nelita Anderson, who was kahuna on both sides of her family. This is back in the early 90s. And she waited very patiently for me to stop talking, and then she patted me on the arm and smiled sweetly at me and said, "Hank, it's not called huna. When you read a book about huna, you're reading a book written by an outsider who does not know. Who does not know?" She said, huna is not the correct word for the Hawaiian spiritual knowledge. And so I looked at her and I said, "Well, Nelita, if a word was to be used, what word would it be?" And she said, "Well, we never had a word for it. But if a word was to be used, it would be the word ho'omana. Ho'omana. This word right here. Now you know what mana is. Mana is energy or power. When you put ho'o in front of it, it turns it into a verb. Ho'o mana means literally to empower, to place in authority. And it reveals once again this intimate relationship between knowledge and power. When you have knowledge, you have power. When you have power, you have knowledge. Now, the religion of the Hawaiians, this so-called state-level religion, which was in situ when Captain Cook arrived, it was run by a priestly class called the kahuna pule. Kahuna means master of, and pule means prayer, masters of prayer. And they were distinct from the shamans, the kahuna kupua, the masters of spirits. As in all traditions, the shamans, the mystics, were known as masters of spirits. The religion itself was focused in places of power or temples, pre-Christian places of worship called heiaus. And I'm going to be showing you some tonight in slides. We'll also see some tikis, and the Hawaiian word for tiki is ki'i. Ki'i. A tiki is a structured image of any kind. And we'll say something about these later as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the slides and we'll work from there with some visuals. Oh, thanks. And the first slide I thought I would show you is an image of Makua. I thought I would show you what this guy looked like. Because if anybody ever looked the part, he did. That is Hale Makua. I took this photograph. It was the first photograph that I ever took of him. And it was the day that we met at the volcano. At the end of that long day, I asked his permission to make a photograph to commemorate the event. And he agreed. And I really like, this is in a way my most favorite photograph because I can see in his eyes the formalness, but also the approval. He's obviously very pleased that we have been brought into connection. And he gave me a beautiful gift that day, so I didn't have anything to give him in return. So I immediately took off the tribal beads that I had been wearing since the old days in Africa and gave them to him. And he very gamely put them on and wore them for the photograph. I never saw him wear them again. Okay? But this is the man who was the kahuna nui of Hawaii. Now, Polynesia. In looking at this map, it's kind of a hokey map taken right out of a book, but it serves its purpose. This great triangle here in the oceanic world is the triangle of Polynesia. And all of those people are related to each other by descent from common migrations. They speak languages which are very closely related, and of course they're genetically closely related as well. Okay? Hawaii is in the north, Easter Island, Rapa Nui in the southeast, and Aotearoa, New Zealand in the southwest. And all of these islands here, Polynesia. Micronesia is the western Pacific west of Polynesia, and Melanesia includes Australia and New Zealand. Now, the current culture of people who call themselves Polynesians, migrated from Southeast Asia around New Guinea. They were maritime people. They came from the Philippines, from the Chinese mainland in all likelihood, and from Indonesia. They migrated north around New Guinea, and they settled the area of the Western Pacific first. They were called the Lapita culture because they had pottery. Unfortunately, there's no clay in Polynesia, so their pottery very rapidly disappears. But this became the secondary area of dispersal, and it was from here that they went east into the Society Islands where Tahiti is, and eventually all the way to Easter Island. They went south to New Zealand, arriving there about 800 years ago, and north to the Hawaiian Islands, arriving there around the time of Jesus of Nazareth or a little bit later. They traveled in starships. That is a starship. Unlike the Starship Enterprise, which is an illusion, that's a real one. Now, I say that was a starship because these Polynesian people traveled in these great double-hulled voyaging canoes with a platform strapped between the two hulls. The navigators, the wayfinders, steered by the stars. They steered by the winds, by the patterns of migrating birds, by the taste and temperature of the water. And of course, when you consider that Hawaii is 2,500 miles from the nearest land, you wonder how they ever found it. Unless, of course, you know something about the shaman and the shaman's ability to see across the middle world. And that is precisely what they did. That's precisely how they found these islands. They took everything with them on these voyages because when they made landfall at distant islands, they were probably uninhabited and they probably had no food crops. So they took breadfruit cuttings, they took chickens, they took their dogs, they took coconuts, they took bananas and pigs. They took everything with them. Everything with them. Here's a really beautiful painting. These paintings, incidentally, are done by Herb Kane. He's a national treasure, an artist in Hawaii. Nobody does it better than Herb. I mean, look at the way he paints the water. These are oil paintings. This is a wonderful painting of one of these big double-hulled voyaging canoes arriving at the island of Hawaii after a voyage of maybe 30 or 40 days. All right, and the island is awake. The volcano is active. And as many of you know, the volcano is felt to be inhabited by a goddess named Pele. I'm going to show you a photograph of Pele tonight at the end of the second half. But here they are arriving, starving and thirsty. The first wave of migrating people to arrive in Hawaii from this migration around 200 AD, they set up slices of land divisions that went from the mountain down to the ocean, kind of pie-shaped wedges that were determined by suitable canoe landing, arable land, fresh water. And virtually everything you see here, the coconut palms, the taro fields, the bananas, this is probably breadfruit, maybe these are mangoes. Virtually everything you see here was brought to Hawaii. None of these plants were native to Hawaii when they arrived. So they were all brought by that first wave of migrating people. Now, they set up camp and they lived in these islands for almost 1,000 years. Because of the distance between Hawaii and anywhere else, transoceanic voyaging was rare, was very rare. About 1200 AD, a Tahitian priest named Pa'au arrived. And this Tahitian priest visited all the islands. He stayed for a year and a half or so, visited all the chiefs, and then he abruptly disappeared. 5 years later, he returned with a fleet of canoes filled with warriors, and they took the Hawaiian Islands by military conquest. They killed the chiefs of the original people, and the survivors became the maka'aina, the commoners. The newcomers set themselves up as the new chiefly class, the ali'i. Now, these ali'i were very impressive specimens. This is a painting of Kamehameha the Great, the first king. It's spelled with a T instead of a K because originally the Hawaiian language had a T instead of a K. But when the missionaries were listening to the words, they wrote it down wrong. This is when the T became a K and the R became an L. All right? Now, Kamehameha, the man who became the first king of Hawaii, he was a very impressive specimen. You see that javelin that he's holding? Well, that javelin is kept with great honor in a small museum in downtown Kailua Kona on the west side of the island of Hawaii. And that javelin is 14 feet long. It was the custom at that time, 200 years ago, to make the javelin twice the height of the man who carried it, which means that Kamehameha was close to 7 feet tall. And when you put that basketry helmet fletched with the feathers of birds on top of his head, he would have been huge. He would have been huge. He would have been this tall, standing here next to me. All right? They were very impressive people. Now, the way in which he became king is an interesting story. And since this man is Makua's ancestor, keep that in mind. He was shown in a vision that if he were to construct a great temple, a heiau, at a place called Pu'ukohola, which means the hill of the whale, that this place would become the power spot from which he could launch his career, launch his conquest, really, of the Hawaiian Islands to become the first king. That's Kamehameha right there. All right? And he is participating in constructing this great temple site. All of these stones were passed hand to hand over a human chain that was 20 miles long from the other side of the island. I mean, when these chiefs wanted something to be done, all they had to do was say it, and it happened. Now, in order to sanctify the heiau, here's the heiau on top of the hill. It required a human sacrifice. Now, in those days, you didn't just grab a slave and kill him. Only the highest could be sacrificed, and they had to offer themselves. That was the correct protocol. So what Kamehameha did is he sent for his competitor, High Chief Kīlauea, who was the rightful paramount chief of the island of Hawaii. Now, Kīlauea lived on the other side of the island, and he'd had a string of catastrophes. Among them, most of his army had been killed in a volcanic eruption, and he felt that the gods had turned against him. So when Kamehameha summoned him to come and visit this new heiau, Kīlauea knew that he'd been chosen to be the human sacrifice. He also knew that if he didn't go, that Kamehameha would send his army and kill him, and all of his people as well, enslave his people. And so in order to save his people, he went with several canoes of his warriors. That's Kīlauea standing right there. Kamehameha is here on the beach, right here. Now, when he arrived, he was killed by these warriors over here. And the bodies of his kahunas who came with him, all 11 of them, plus Kīlauea, were taken into this heiau as human sacrifices. And from this heiau, Kamehameha then became the king. You can see it's a very impressive structure. When we do workshops in Hawaii, we take people here so that they can feel what it's like to stand next to a great place of power. Because the heiaus were always built on places where there were dense concentrations of mana in the ground. Here's a painting of Kamehameha in his old age at Kailua Kona. Here are the ahi, those big tuna, which are so good to eat. There is his favorite wife, Ka'ahumanu. He had many wives. And there is his personal heiau out here in the bay. I show it to you because when you go to Hawaii today, this place has been reconstructed and you can see it. You can't go inside, but you can see it. And typically, these heiaus had a platform which designated the sacred area, and a big house, and a tower, and images of the deities to whom the heiau was dedicated. That reconstruction, it's actually been reconstructed today, was based on a drawing. It was made by a French explorer in 1816 when Kamehameha was still alive. This was the original drawing of the heiau. Here you see the tower. Here you see the deities. Here's an altar with a pig on it, an offering. And here's that big house. Now, in looking at the way in which these heiaus were set up, the platform was the sacred area. The commoners could not go in. Only the chiefs and the priests were allowed to go in. The big house that I've just shown you was called the Hale Mana, the Mana house, the house of power. Because when a high chief died, all right, they didn't bury their dead. They would bring the high chief in And the chief's body, this would be true for a woman as well, would be placed in an underground oven, and the flesh would literally be baked off of the bones. And then all of the bones would be carefully collected and placed into a woven senet casket or bag. All right? And these bags are usually about this long. All right? And the senet is made from the fiber of coconut husk. The bones of the chief were felt to contain their mana, their power. And so all of these bones of the chief were kept in the mana house. And with each chief's demise, the mana of the heiau increased exponentially. Here would be the place where they kept the drums for the ceremonies. There is the altar. Here are the images, the tikis. We'll say something about them in just a moment. And there's the tower. The tower is called the Anu'u Tower. And the Anu'u Tower is roughly symbolic of the cosmic axis, the axis mundi. The priests would go into the tower and up these different layers to talk to the oversouls, to the gods and the deities in the upper worlds. This was the function of it. Here is the remains of one of these really big heiaus. This one's on the island of Oahu. It's actually a menehune heiau. Some of you who've been to Hawaii know about the menehunes, these diminutive people who lived there before the Polynesians arrived. They're sometimes equated with leprechauns or little spirits, but they weren't. They were real people. They were the race that lived in Polynesia before the Polynesians came there. So this one is probably over 2,000 years old. This is Makua sitting here with his partner Nina and my wife Jill. Now, to give you some idea of how big these are, I walked down this hill and around in front of it and then took a photograph shooting back up. That's Makua standing on top, and this gives you some idea of how huge this platform is. It's solid stone. These are really big structures. Here's another one. This one is called Hale Okiave, a heiau right here. It's at a place called the Pu'uhonua, and it's about 15 minutes away from where my farm is in Hawaii. It's a place of refuge. It's been reconstructed by the National Park Service based on this drawing that was made in 1826 by another French explorer. And if we zero in, we can see here is the halemana, here are the tikis, the images to whom the heiau was dedicated. These are images of the Akua, the deity called Lono, and we're going to talk about Lono in just a moment. And there's this long wall. This long wall, it's 3,000 feet long, 14 feet high, and 12 feet thick. It was made probably at least 500 years ago. And inside this wall was a sanctuary. Here's the wall. We're inside the wall now. There's one of these big heiau platforms. Here's another one here that hasn't been reconstructed yet. It's been knocked down by earthquakes and tidal waves. This was a place of refuge. In the old days in Hawaii, they had a system of laws called kanawai. Kanawai. And the laws were very simple. If you broke the law, you were killed. That meant if you stepped on a chief's shadow, or you touched a chief's food ball, or you accidentally glanced into the chief's eyes, you'd be seized by the warriors and killed right on the spot. No Johnny Cochran, no fancy trials, no appeals, no lawyers. It was done. All right, now this kept that whole society in a state of rigid balance. Nobody broke the law. Crime was unknown. But if you had an accident, you accidentally stepped on the chief's shadow and you could get away from the warriors before they grabbed you and killed you. And if you could get into this sanctuary before the warriors caught you, you could be cleansed by the priests and re-released as a free person, a free man or a free woman into Hawaiian society once again. So these places were very, very important. They provided a place of refuge for lawbreakers. It was a place of forgiveness. And when we do retreats in Hawaii, we take people here so that they can feel what this place is like. And we usually encourage them to work on some issue in their life for which they need forgiveness. This is the big mountain Mauna Loa, the western flank of it. My farm is roughly up there. There's a big stone here. Oh, we're going to talk about standing stones tonight, the second half. So don't miss it. This stone is about 16 feet long, and it was originally a vertical stone. It's a spectacularly beautiful place. If you ever have the chance to go to the Big Island of Hawaii, you must go there. And if you go at the end of the day when all the tourists have gone home, it's part of the national park system. You'll be the only people there. You'll probably be the only people there. It's a very powerful place. And if you go down, see, there's the Hale Okiawe there, and there's the wall. The sanctuary is inside. We're on the outside. This is a canoe landing, and the tiki right there reveals that it's a canoe landing only for chiefs. Commoners had to go on the other side. Yeah?
What's the name of this place?
The Pu'uhonua at Honano. You got that? It's called the City of Refuge, but it's not a city. The place of refuge in English. Now this was the world that Captain Cook accidentally dropped in on. And I think it was 1777. He was sailing from Australia across the northern Pacific to the coast of western North America. And he stumbled across these islands completely by accident. They were not on any British Admiralty maps. He happened to arrive at this time of year, right now, the time of the harvest, which was called makahiki. And during the time of the harvest, this big standard, this big kind of flag made of tapa cloth would be carried around the island, announcing the beginning of makahiki. During the makahiki, all civil conflict and strife was forbidden, because the Hawaiians understood that military societies have very little respect for life, and if they were allowed to disrupt the harvest, the people would starve. Here is Captain Cook's ship right there. You'll notice that there is a definite resemblance between the sails of the ship and the symbol, which is the symbol for the god Lono. We're going to talk about Lono in just a moment. These are Herb Kane's paintings again, which kind of bring this information to life. This must have been an absolutely fantastic meeting, because the Brits were not expecting these islands, nor were they expecting people as highly stratified as the Hawaiians. This is the state canoe of High Chief Kalanio Pu'u, and it's approaching the Resolution. There's Captain Cook standing right there. This is a great big block fault for those of you interested in geology. This is a place called Kīlauea Bay. Kīlauea Bay. Now, if I were to go over here and stand on this beach right here, here I am on the beach right there, and look back out. Cook's ship was originally out here. You see this big block fold here? That's a big crack, and all of this land has dropped down. This is the place where the Spirit Stone came from. Those of you who've read Spirit Walker and the books that follow are aware of the fact that I am the caretaker of a sacred stone. This is a stone that has a god living in it. It's one of the personages in my books, and I'm going to show that stone to you. It came from this beach right here. This is for those of you who've read my books and who've read about this stone. This is one view of it. It's big. It's about 2 feet tall, weighs about 100 pounds. Here's another view of it when it's dry. This is when it lived in my backyard here in Carmichael. Now you've seen it. That stone has a name. Some of you know what the name of this stone is. That stone came from down here. This is that beach where I taught my children how to swim and how to surf, and one of them how to walk. There's a big heiau there dedicated to Lono. There's the whole heiau here. Starts here, goes across to here. Little parking lot in the front with the ocean right there. If I were to go around the side of it and shoot back up, here's the front of the heiau right there, the parking lot. Look at the size of this huge temple. I would only be about this tall standing next to it. These structures are immense. They're just absolutely immense. They're places of great power. It was on the surface of this heiau that Captain Cook was served a meal, and he read the first burial service. The first Christian service in the Hawaiian Islands was on the surface of this heiau. It was a burial for an unfortunate British seaman who was killed in a difference of opinion with the locals. And the Hawaiians very gallantly offered to bury this British seaman in the Hale. And what the British didn't realize, the British thought this was a great honor. What the Brits didn't realize is that the Hawaiians were actually taking this Brit as a human sacrifice. This is sort of an area of controversy in Hawaii today because nobody wants to admit it. Nobody wants to admit that they practiced human sacrifice. Today, on the surface of this heiau, there is only this lele, this altar. And underneath the altar is a standing stone. We're going to talk about the standing stones in the second half tonight. Now, as some of you know, all right, Captain Cook came to a very bad end. He actually left the Hawaiian Islands after a stay of almost 3 months, and he went out to sea and he encountered a storm which cracked the mainmast of his ship. And so he had to sail back to the island to cut a tree to make a new mast for his ship. And when he came back, Makahiki was over. And a lot of civil conflict and strife had broken out again. And what happened was that the Hawaiians stole one of these cutters. That's a cutter. They stole one of them. Now the Brits don't like it when you steal their stuff. Okay, so Cook made a fateful decision. That's his ship out there. There's Captain Vancouver's ship over there. He came ashore with a group of his Marines at a place called Ka'awaloa, and he marched across the land to the village of Ka'awaloa where King Kalaniʻopuʻu was living, and he grabbed Kalaniʻopuʻu and kept to be a hostage against the return of the cutter. And in the process, his Marines put their hands on the chief. Nobody puts their hands on the chief. So what the Hawaiians did is they just killed all of them. They killed all of them, all of the Brits. And here's Captain Cook, who's just about to receive the coup de grace. And that was the end of him. That was the end of him. His body was taken by the Hawaiians into the community. And when Captain Vancouver completed the negotiations for the return of his corpse to take it back to England, only his hands remained. We won't say what happened to the rest of him. But those hands were then packed in salt and taken back to England, where they were buried and stayed in Westminster Abbey. And that was the end of Cook. This is Kīlauea Bay today from the other side. That's where Cook was killed, where that obelisk is over here. And that's where I was standing on the beach way over there. This is a marine park today, and I just show it to you because a lot of people who swim with dolphins swim with the dolphins in this particular bay. It's a fabulous place. This tall Hawaiian woman in the foreground, that's Peggy. Peggy was the Hawaiian woman who sold my farm to me. It was her farm before it was mine. She's actually the descendant of one of the great Hawaiian navigators. And she's a spectacular specimen. Peggy was an Olympic class swimmer when she was young. And to see Peggy underwater in her macrame bikini is kind of a religious experience. You know, here's a photograph of Peggy for the front. That's when I acquired the farm from her. She was just 30 years old then. And she's a really magnificent looking woman. This is a photograph taken on her sailboat when we were sailing over from Honolulu to Kona during that time. That was her way of steering her boat. She had her own 28-foot sloop. Here's a picture that she took of me. The old man in the sea. All right, there I am still steering her boat. That's her little dog. That little dog, that little poodle, never perfected the art of taking a leak on board. And that little dog is desperately looking for land. It's terrible. I watched this little dog slowly turn green. Because it took about 24 hours to sail from Honolulu over to Kona. We arrived in the afternoon. I have to redeem myself by showing you a picture of Jill. This is the mother of my children, the lady of my heart. Some of you know her, but for those, you've heard me talk about my wife and her abilities with soul retrieval. That's what Jill looked like. I took that photograph of her in the Frank Lloyd Wright House, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Her hair is mostly gray now. And just for fun, that's a photograph of me. That's what I look like without my beard. This photograph was taken by a professional photographer in Hawaii just before I left in 1989. Different time. Different time. Now, to get back to the Hawaiian mysticism. When the Christian missionaries arrived in Hawaii, and they immediately set about Christianizing the heathens, they asked the Hawaiians what these big images on their temple platforms were. And the Hawaiians said, oh, those are akua, A-K-U-A. And when the missionaries asked them to whom they prayed for power, for protection, for support, the Hawaiians said, oh, we pray to our akua. Well, the missionaries thought, and they still think today, that the Hawaiians simply worshipped idols as gods. That they simply worshipped idols as gods. And in doing so, they missed something absolutely phenomenal. These statues of deities are symbols. And they have an outer meaning and they have an inner meaning. And in the outer meaning, they are actually gods, the akua, the high gods of the upper worlds. In the inner meaning, they represent aspects of ourselves. Now, this little diagram sort of lays this out for you. I would ask that if you sketch this out for yourself, I'll show it to you several times, that you not Xerox it, publish it, hand it around. This is from somebody's unpublished manuscript, and it would get me in a lot of trouble if, you know, this diagram was sort of generally shared with the public at large. But now let me point something out to you here, if you follow my pointer. Right in the center is the word wailua, and a triangle that says the two souls. Wailua, wai means water or river, and lua means two. In this case, it's referring to two souls. And those two souls are this one here and this one here. The uhane is roughly analogous to what we would call the conscious soul or the mental soul. The unihipili is associated with what we would call the subconscious or the physical soul, the soul of the body. The third soul is the upper one here, the Makua, which roughly translates as utterly trustworthy ancestral spirit. Utterly trustworthy ancestral spirit. I'll mention it again at the second half tonight. This is the higher self or oversoul. So the three souls, the Makua, the Uhane, and the Unihipili, these are the three souls of man. And these two souls right here are a unity which the Hawaiians called Wailua, the two souls. Now, I'm going to start with this one because we are so oriented towards the mental soul in our society. The mental soul corresponds to what Freud called the ego and what Carl Jung called the conscious mind. Now, in the outer tradition, the uhane was symbolized by the god Lono. This is Lono. These are two original statues of the god Lono. And here we have a human figurative form standing in a very powerful position. The mouth is symbolic, highly symbolic. That sort of scowling mouth has to do with sound. Now, in sharing this knowledge with you, I'm coming from Makua's knowledge, okay? You'll not find this sound in any books on Huna. Lono is roughly analogous to what we would call the Logos. In the beginning was the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, except it wasn't a word. It was a sound. And Lono is symbolic of that sound. Lono, as a deity, was a real man once. He was a real man. He originally came from the Southern Ocean, from the Tuamotu Islands, the place of the red-haired people. Okay? This is south of Tahiti. This is in the mythic past, thousands of years ago. Lono was a real man. In the Southern Ocean, he was known as Rono, because L is an R in that part of the world. Originally, he was a warrior, because all men are warriors in Polynesian society until they go into the next stage of life. And as a warrior, he was feared all over the Southern Pacific. His nickname was Ai Kanaka. Ai means food, and Kanaka means man. He killed them and ate them. He was a cannibal. But he later became a tremendous healer. And so Lono, the god, who is derived from the man, is also kind of like the Polynesian Apollo. He's the healing god. Lono the healer. He's especially associated with healing plants, with herbs, herbalistic healing, and with agriculture. If you have a garden, that garden is sacred to Lono. If you have medicinal herbs or you use medicinal herbs, those herbs are sacred to Lono. Lono is also associated with very mental activities like science, navigation, meteorology. Since I'm a scientist, I worship at the shrine of Lono, so to speak. And Lono is the weatherman. Meteorology, he's the rainmaker. He's the one who brings the rain, and he's the keeper of the winds. All of these aspects of the natural world are associated with Lono. And again, here you see this interesting phenomenon of the supernatural and the idea that goes up in the air is symbolic of mental thoughts. Those are ways of expressing thought forms. Here's another image of Lono. All right? Again, this very powerful body, a very interesting face with a headdress on it, which reflects his high status, and then this curious object rising out of the top of the head. That's a way of expressing the power of creative thought. And this one, this is more crude. This actually came from that Hale, the place of refuge. All right? Again, the eyes are concealed, and here is that power of creative thought rising out of the top of the head. Now, that's Lono in the outer tradition, and there's a lot we could say about him, a lot of stories. Lono is actually one of Makua's ancestors. And the island of Hawaii was Lono's island. He sailed north from the Southern Ocean, and he came to Hawaii. And the sacred name of Hawaii Island, is Lono Nui Akea. That's the sacred name of that island. That was Lono's island, the healing island. In the inner tradition, Lono is associated with the mental soul that we would call the intellect or the ego. Now, this aspect of the self, this soul, has very specific functions. This is the aspect of ourself that thinks, analyzes, integrates, and makes decisions. All right? The aspect of ourself that thinks, the mental aspect, the intellectual aspect, it thinks, analyzes, integrates, and makes decisions. And as such, your Lono soul, if I just refer to it that way, your Lono soul is your inner director. It's your inner director, your inner chief, your inner CEO, your chief executive officer. Your Lono soul is the aspect of yourself which is responsible for steering you successfully or unsuccessfully through life. Now, how successfully your Lono soul functions depends on the beliefs and convictions that it holds. All of our beliefs and convictions about the outer world and the inner world are created and held by the Lono soul. If your Lono soul believes itself to be powerless, you're not going to have a very interesting life. You're going to lead your life in a kind of a victim role on the receiving end of life. Life is going to be eating you instead of you eating life. However, if your inner Lono soul believes itself to be powerful, effective, and so on, you're going to have a very different life. You're going to lead your life like a chief. And Hale Makua was always inviting all of those people who regarded him as a teacher, he was always inviting them to develop that inner chief. To develop that inner chief. The Lono soul is also the source of your volition and your intentionality. Now, your intentionality is extraordinarily important because that's the aspect of yourself that creates goals, that creates objectives, that creates thought forms of things that you want to achieve in life or have come into your life. It's the aspect of yourself that moves you towards those objectives and goals, acquiring new abilities, acquiring new knowledge, and so forth and so on. These are all part and parcel of what this deity symbolizes. Lono is also the source of your creative imagination, the aspect of yourself which is creative. You see, these vertical expressions from the headdress, those are the power of creative thought. You can see this creative thought emerging from the top of this Lono, and then up here there's a thought form. Looks like a little head or something. This Lono is obviously thinking about something. It's kind of like those little balloons you see in cartoons above somebody's head, and there are words inside them. That's a way of expressing it in a sculptural form. It's a beautiful example of kahuna symbol writing. You know, in showing you these Polynesian carvings, when the Polynesian religion was overthrown in 1819 with Kamehameha's death, the missionaries, the Christians, demanded that the Hawaiians burn all of their sacred sculpture. Only 170 pieces of original Hawaiian art survived in all of the Hawaiian Islands. And when you see the power of these images, you realize what a great tragedy this was. You know, I don't mean to sound anti-Christian, that's not my function. But, you know, the missionaries that we sent out into the third world 200 years ago, these were not the most highly educated people, all right? They were very zealous, fundamentalist Christians, very misguided often, and they were not at all interested in the people that they found themselves in relationship with. What they were interested in was converting them to their own religion, because they were going to get strokes in heaven for doing so. Now, this is the aspect of ourself which functions as our mental aspect, our intellect. Again, the aspect of ourself that thinks, analyzes, integrates, assigns meaning to, and makes decisions. Your inner director, the source of your volition, the source of your intentionality, and the source of your creative ability, your creativity. This is the Lono. And as such, it represents this soul right here that the Hawaiians actually called Uhane. I'm just calling it the Lono soul to equate it with that particular deity. Now the second soul, we'll say something briefly about it before we take our break. The second soul we'll talk about is the body soul, the physical soul, the physical aspect of the self. And in the outer tradition, this soul was associated with a deity, a different deity, the deity called Ku, K-U. In the Southern Ocean, it was called Tu, with a T. That's Ku. In fact, this image is in the British Museum, and it was brought back from Hawaii on Captain Cook's ship. This image is almost 7 feet tall. It's an incredibly powerful image. This is about power. Ku is about power. Ku is the foundation on which everything is built. Ku is the archetypal warrior. Ku, again, was a real man once, feared all over the Pacific. All right? And you can see, in this case, we don't have a headdress that goes up in the air like this. What we've got are streamers that come down and back and touch the ground, establishing contact with the physical world. This is a symbolic way of associating Ku with this physical world right here. Now, as a deity, in the outer tradition, Ku is about warriorness. All right? If you're a warrior, if you're in the Army, Navy, Marines, or Air Force, you worship at the shrine of Ku. Ku is the warrior, the god of war. Ku is also the deity of sorcerers and business. This tells you something very interesting about the business world. All right, this tells you something very interesting about the business world. Business, sorcery, and warfare, they're all represented by the same archetype. See, business is not about cooperation. Business is about competition, in which there's always somebody who wins and somebody who loses. That's warfare. It's a form of warfare. Ku is also about fertility. But primarily Ku's realm is this world right here. This physical world right here. Here's another image of Ku from the Salem Peabody Museum in Massachusetts. Okay, it's an old one. You can see the streamers that come down and touch ground and back have been broken off. And this one is at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Believe it or not, these are the only 3 images of Ku that survived. And I just showed you the only images of Lono, almost the only images of Lono that survived as well. So all that remains. Really a tragedy. Again, in this case, this big mouth is about intimidation. This is the mouth that says, I'm going to kill you and eat you. It's about power. Ku is about powerful. Ku the powerful. Lono, the fruitful. Lono is about food, about growth, about agriculture. This guy is about war. This guy is about war. Now, in the inner tradition, Ku was associated with the physical body soul, which the Hawaiians called unihipili. Unihipili, the body soul. And the body soul is associated with very specific functions. And I'll list them for you, and then we'll take a break, and we'll talk more about them in the second half before we go on to the higher self. Number 1, the primary function of the body soul is memory. This is where your memory banks are. Your memory is not up here in your lono. It's down here in your body. Number 2, the Ku is the source of all your emotions and feelings, which is why some people like Deepak Chopra call it the emotional body. It's the source of all your emotions and feelings. Number 3, the entire operation of your physical body is under its direct control. All of those functions that we think of as physiology, nephrology, neurology, nerve impulse transmission, digestion, respiration, reproduction, circulation, your heart beating, all of those functions are under the control of your body soul. See, if you had to think about your heart beating, it'd probably last about 30 seconds. And then the minute your attention turned to something else, your heart would stop beating and you'd die. All right? In this sense, when you think about this, all right, the Ku soul is like your inner hard drive. It's like your inner hard drive. And it contains all the evolutionary software that's programmed into your physical body by the evolutionary process. All right? All of those aspects of your body that function automatically, all right, through the evolutionary process, that's all coded into the Ku soul, including the repair and restoration of the physical body. The Ku is the inner healer. The Ku is the inner healer, the aspect of yourself that restores and repairs your physical body. Number 4, the Ku is the source of all your habitual behavior. All of your learned behavior, which is programmed in and then comes out as habits. This is from your Ku. Learned behavior. It's like when you learned how to ride a bicycle or you learned how to drive a car. All right, your Lono soul was in in control of that whole situation from beginning to end. You know, when you're learning how to drive a car, you've got to pay very close attention, you know, to what's going on behind you, what's going on in front of you, the steering wheel, the gas, the clutch, the brake, you know, the gear shift, you know, the turn signals, all the rest of this stuff. But once you learn how to drive the car, you don't have to think about it anymore. It's like if I decide to go down to San Francisco for the weekend, all right, I make the decision with my lono, and then I turn over the operation of the car to my ku. My ku drives the car, and I've got 2 hours of mental free time on the way to San Francisco while my ku is driving the car. And my lono doesn't have to get involved at all until I look in the rearview mirror and I see that blue and red light doing this. And that's when my ku says, let's outrun the bastard. My lono says, absolutely not. Pull over the car. I'm going to talk us out of a ticket. See? The lono is willful. The lono is in control. You know, the ku is very willful. It's like a child. My ku likes to drive fast. So my wife is always telling me to slow down. Slow down. You're going to get a ticket. You're going to get a ticket. My ku is driving the car fast. All right? Number 5. The ku is the interface between ourself and the other. It's the aspect of ourself that perceives. It perceives the outer world in which we act, as well as the inner worlds in which we think, feel, and dream. All right? It's the aspect of ourself that perceives the outer world in which we act, as well as the inner worlds in which we think, we feel, and we dream. And in this sense, the ku is the interface between ourself and the outer world and ourself and the inner world. See, the lono just thinks and directs. It's the inner director. It's the ku that interfaces with this world right here, the physical world. And as such, number 6, the ku soul is the sender and receiver of all psychic experience, as well as all shamanic experience. It's the sender and receiver of all psychic experience and all shamanic experience. And we'll talk more about that, especially the next time we meet. Next week is the week before Thanksgiving, and so we will not have class, but we will meet the week after. Number 7, the ku is programmed to grow, increase, and become more. The ku is programmed to grow, to increase, and become more. It's not programmed to deny, repress, and contain. All right? And when we hold repressed memories, when we go into denial, when we contain within ourselves traumas. We talked about trauma a couple of weeks ago and its relationship to soul loss and disharmony and fear. Right? When the ku is holding a lot of trauma, it tends to go into fear mode. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem. It's not programmed to do that. It's programmed to grow, to increase, to become more. Because this is how we acquire new skills. This is how we become more than we were. Number 8, the ku reasons. And it reasons logically. You only put your finger at a candle flame once, because the ku remembers what works as well as what hurts. All right, the ku reasons. It can reason deductively. And finally, number 9, like a good servant or a good computer, the ku does what it's told. The ku obeys orders. Like a good servant or a good computer, the ku obeys orders. It does what it's told. And who tells it what to do? The lono. This is the master. This is the servant. The lono decides what to do in life, and the ku enables it. The ku acts on those directives it gets from the lono. So these two souls, the lono and the ku, again, here they are. The lono on one side, uhane, the ku on the other. Together they compose what is called the wailua, the two souls. Here is the soul cluster. These two souls are in relationship, the lono and the ku. Throughout our life, each one of you has a lono, each one of you has a ku. Now, I don't want to deprive you of a cup of coffee, so I think we'll take a break here, and we'll talk more about the ku.